There are moments in a marriage when a single piece of paper changes everything. Not the wedding certificate. Not the birth announcements. Not the public declarations of love performed in front of cameras and crowds. A different kind of paper entirely. The kind written in careful legal language, buried inside a longer document, placed quietly on a table at the worst possible moment, and signed by someone who had no idea what they were agreeing to. According to veteran investigative journalist and royal biographer Tom Bower, that moment happened for Prince Harry in 2020. And the consequences of what he signed that day, sources close to Bower's research suggest, could define the rest of his life. Bower is not someone who trades in gossip. He spent decades as a practicing barrister before becoming one of Britain's most feared investigative journalists. His career has been built on dismantling powerful people who believed they were untouchable. He exposed Robert Maxwell's decades-long theft from his own employees' pension funds. He went inside Mohammed al-Fayed's empire and pulled out what al-Fayed had spent vast resources concealing. When Bower puts his name on a claim, it is because he has documents, timelines, and multiple sources cross-referenced until the contradictions collapse. That is the man now saying that buried inside a prenuptial amendment Harry signed in 2020 is a clause so significant it could determine the financial and personal fate of the Duke of Sussex for years, possibly decades, to come. To understand why any of this matters, you have to start not with Harry, but with Meghan. And not with Harry and Meghan's story, but with a much earlier chapter that most people have largely forgotten. Before there was a prince, there was a television producer named Trevor Engelson. Meghan dated him for years, married him in Jamaica in 2011, and divorced him in 2013, citing irreconcilable differences. The whole affair was handled so quietly that it barely registered as news at the time. But what happened inside that divorce settlement, according to people familiar with the proceedings, was anything but quiet. When Meghan sat down with her legal team to negotiate the terms of the split, the lawyers on Trevor's side reportedly were not prepared for what walked into the room. She had not come with a single representative. She arrived with a team. She had reportedly reviewed every document line by line before the first meeting took place. She pushed back on every clause that did not serve her long-term financial independence, and she inserted language that her first husband reportedly only fully understood months after the ink had dried. The specific clause that proved most consequential gave Meghan full ownership of any future earnings derived from projects she had worked on or developed during the marriage, even if those projects had not yet produced any income at the time of the divorce. It was a forward-looking clause. It did not simply divide what existed. It reached into the future and claimed a portion of it. Trevor Engelson, according to sources familiar with his account of those events, later described the experience to a close friend as walking through a door he thought led to one room and discovering it led somewhere else entirely. That lesson, according to Bower's research, stayed with Meghan. Protect your financial independence above all else. Never allow your earning potential to become legally entangled with another person's decisions. Walk away clean, with your future intact and under your own control. And when she married Prince Harry 7 years later, she had not forgotten a single word of it. The structure of a royal prenuptial agreement is nothing like the documents most people have encountered. A standard prenup lists each party's existing assets and establishes how shared property would be divided upon a separation. Royal prenuptial agreements operate on an entirely different scale. They are designed to protect not just the couple's personal wealth, but assets that belong in trust to future generations. They contain detailed provisions governing the use of royal titles after separation, language controlling what can be disclosed publicly about the family, and clauses designed to manage image and reputation across decades. When Harry and Meghan married in 2018, their original agreement had to navigate a specific collision between that royal legal framework and California's community property laws. Under California law, anything earned during a marriage is generally treated as jointly owned by both spouses. That includes streaming revenue, media contracts, book advances, and income generated by any business or brand launched after the wedding date. The original prenuptial agreement attempted to establish clear boundaries around this. But then came 2020, and with it, the amendment that changed everything. The amendment was not presented to Harry as something significant or consequential. According to sources with knowledge of the timeline, it was framed as routine paperwork. A standard update to reflect the couple's evolving financial activities as they prepared to step back from senior royal duties and establish themselves commercially in the United States. Harry was in the middle of one of the most psychologically destabilizing periods of his life. The formal announcement of their departure from senior royal roles had just been made. His relationship with his brother was fracturing in ways that felt irreparable. His security detail was being removed. His income was disappearing. His identity as a working royal was evaporating in real time. Mental health professionals who have reviewed Harry's own public statements about this period have described it as consistent with acute psychological crisis. His UK legal team was almost entirely occupied with separate media litigation. His California-based legal representation, sources suggest, lacked deep expertise in the specific implications of prenuptial amendments under California family law. He trusted Meghan completely. So when the document was placed in front of him, he signed it. He did not read it carefully. He had no independent legal voice in the room urging him to stop and think. He signed because she asked him to. What he signed, buried on page 14 of that amendment, was an intellectual property clause that Bauer's sources describe as one of the most comprehensive financial instruments they had seen inside a celebrity marriage agreement. Intellectual property, in legal terms, covers an enormous range of assets. It includes brand names, logos, and registered trademarks. It includes the rights to stories, books, documentary content, and any media built around a person's identity or public profile. It includes the right to commercially profit from a person's own name and likeness. And it includes revenue streams generated by any platform or enterprise built around who that person publicly is. According to Bauer's sources, the clause Harry signed did not simply divide these assets equally between the two of them. It reportedly established Meghan as the primary owner of the Sussex brand, their joint ventures, their shared media content, and the revenue connected to projects including Harry's memoir. It listed her as the business manager of their shared commercial enterprises. Under California law, that designation carries significant legal weight in any financial dispute. But the element of the clause that Bauer describes as the most consequential is not the existing assets. It is the forward-looking language. The clause reportedly extends its reach to cover any future project developed using assets, relationships, platforms, or the public profile established during the marriage. What that means in practice is sobering. Even if Harry were to leave, start completely fresh, and attempt to build something entirely new, if that new enterprise drew in any way on his royal background, his Invictus platform, his public identity as a Sussex, or any professional relationship formed during the marriage, Meghan would reportedly hold a legal claim to a share of it. It is not merely a divorce clause. It functions, according to those who reviewed it for Bauer, as an indefinite financial claim on who Harry is and who he was. His name, his history, his life story could become, in legal terms, something she has substantial control over long after any separation. Bauer also traced where the legal language originated. The same lawyers who handled Meghan's divorce from Trevor Engelson were reportedly consulted during the drafting of this amendment. They had already seen her negotiate. They already knew what she prioritized. And they constructed language that reflected, with considerable precision, the lesson she had taken from her first marriage and had been waiting to apply at a much larger scale. By 2022, something had shifted in the public presentation of Harry and Meghan as a couple. Joint appearances became less frequent. Unified public statements began to feel more transactional than organic. And while commentators and tabloids spent their energy speculating about the state of the marriage, Meghan was, according to Bauer's reporting, engaged in something far more methodical. She was building. And she was building alone. American Riviera Orchard appeared as a trademark filing registered entirely in her name. No reference to Harry. No joint ownership. No shared documentation. A podcast arrangement followed, again structured with her listed as the sole proprietor. Creative projects were registered and developed under financial structures that contained no formal connection to her husband whatsoever. Every business entity created during this period told the same story. This was not a shared commercial future being constructed. This was a personal financial fortress being assembled, wall by wall, entity by entity. Bauer's financial sources described the specific mechanism reportedly used to move revenue away from jointly held structures into independently controlled accounts. Under California law, income directed into what is known as a single-member LLC, a limited liability company owned entirely by one person, can in certain circumstances be argued to remain the separate legal property of that individual rather than forming part of a shared marital estate. Sources familiar with the Sussex financial arrangements told Bauer that multiple such entities were established in Meghan's name alone during this period. Harry's name does not appear in any of them. The Netflix arrangement, reported publicly as a deal worth $100 million, was not a guaranteed payment. Entertainment industry professionals explained to Bauer that the figure represented the maximum possible payout only if every contracted piece of content was delivered in full. Several projects were cancelled or never produced. The actual amount received before the arrangement was restructured was reportedly closer to $40 million. Bauer's sources then pressed the question of where that money went and how the flow of it had been structured at the entity level. The reported debt figure connected to Sussex finances during the same period was not, according to Bauer's financial sources, what it appeared to be. A significant portion of it was allegedly structured so that the liabilities appeared jointly held on paper, while the actual financial burden was positioned to land more heavily on Harry's side. The mechanism involves the legal principle that California courts examine who derived the primary economic benefit from spending. If one spouse can demonstrate that expenditures were primarily connected to the other spouse's personal legal battles, international travel, and solo projects rather than their shared commercial ventures, courts can assign a disproportionate share of those debts accordingly. Every financial advisor Bauer consulted described the overall structure using identical language. Textbook. The custody dimension of what Bauer's sources are predicting may ultimately be the most personally devastating element for Harry. California family courts establish custody arrangements based substantially on the existing pattern of care at the time divorce papers are filed. Harry has spent a considerable portion of recent years outside California. Court appearances in London, Invictus events internationally, and extended travel have kept him away from Montecito for significant stretches. Meghan, meanwhile, has remained in California, present in the daily lives of their children, functioning as the primary caregiver in practical terms regardless of whatever private arrangement existed between them. When divorce papers are filed, Bauer's sources indicate that her legal team would immediately present documentation of Harry's absence pattern as direct evidence supporting an application for primary custody. Harry would walk into that fight already at a structural disadvantage, and the financial pressure of the legal battle ahead would compound every difficulty. Tom Bauer's broader portrait of Harry throughout this entire period is not a portrait of a foolish man or a weak one. It is something harder to look at directly. It is the portrait of a man who arrived at his marriage already carrying damage that most people cannot fully imagine. His mother died suddenly and violently when he was 12 years old, and the institution that raised him responded not with warmth or space for grief, but with a requirement that he perform composure for cameras and continue showing up to public engagements. He spent the decades that followed carrying that wound while occupying a ceremonial role that gave him neither real purpose nor real identity, only visibility and obligation. The dependency on external validation that resulted was, according to people around him who spoke to Bauer, something closer to a structural feature of who he had become than a simple character flaw. And Meghan, from very early in their relationship, demonstrated an acute understanding of that wound and how to use it. Former Kensington Palace staff described to Bauer a marriage in which the information Harry received from the world outside was carefully managed. Friends who reached out described the strange experience of briefly getting through to him, only to watch him pull back days later, as though something had been said to him privately that altered his thinking. Everyone who might have asked him a difficult question, who might have offered him a version of events that contradicted what he was being told at home, was gradually removed from his life. By the time the couple left the United Kingdom, Harry had almost no inner circle remaining outside of her. He was in a country that was not his own, financially dependent, psychologically isolated, and surrounded by people whose loyalty was ultimately to her interests rather than his. In January 2026, Meghan rehired Sunshine Sachs, the crisis management and public relations firm she had worked with at the very beginning of her relationship with Harry. On the surface, it was presented as a routine business decision. But people with genuine experience in high-profile divorce strategy described it to Bauer as anything but routine. You do not bring in a firm that built its reputation on managing high-stakes celebrity separations unless the separation is already a settled decision. You bring them in months before filing specifically so that by the time legal papers are formally served, the public narrative has already been shaped, planted, and established. The story that gets told in those months before a filing is the story that tends to stick. It frames the custody battle before it begins. It establishes the emotional landscape in which every subsequent court document will be interpreted. Bauer was precise about the legal timeline that follows. California family law requires 6 months of residency before a divorce petition can formally be filed. Meghan has been a permanent California resident for years. The moment she files, everything constructed since 2020 activates simultaneously. The intellectual property clause on page 14 comes into effect. The asset structures built between 2022 and 2024 lock into place. The financial flows that were routed away from jointly held entities become the framework a California court uses to determine what belongs to whom. The trademarks, the business registrations, the single-member LLCs, the forward-looking language about future projects all become operative at once. And Harry, according to Bauer's sources, will walk into that courtroom with almost none of the protections he believed he had. He faces the potential loss of the Montecito property under existing asset structures. He faces the loss of majority control over the Sussex brand and Archwell under the intellectual property clause he signed without independent legal counsel. He faces a custody fight in which Meghan's legal team has been quietly accumulating documentation for years. And under the forward-looking language buried on page 14, the right to commercially profit from his own name, his own history, and his own life story could be legally constrained for years to come. Harry signed away his brand, his financial future, and significant control over his own identity. He signed it at the single most broken and isolated point of his adult life. He signed it because Meghan placed it in front of him, and there was no one left in his life to tell him to stop and read what he was agreeing to. Tom Bauer has spent 40 years going after powerful people who believed their arrangements were invisible. He exposed Maxwell. He went after Al Fayed. He published his first book about the Sussexes despite injunction attempts, formal complaints to his sources, and what multiple people described as coordinated pressure campaigns designed to silence anyone who cooperated with him. He absorbed all of it and published anyway. The fact that he has returned now, with full knowledge of what is coming at him again, and is publishing a new edition containing this material, tells you everything you need to know about how solid he believes the ground beneath him to be. The clause exists. The documents are filed. The architecture is in place. And by the time Harry fully grasps the scope of what was quietly assembled around him, the legal machinery will already be running. The only question that remains is whether anyone in his life will find a way to reach him before it is too late. And on that question, the people closest to this story are not optimistic.